My name is Renee Castillo, and I'm 31 years old. 4 days after my husband's funeral, my father-in-law stood in my driveway with a real estate agent's card in his hand and told me the house needed to go on the market by the end of the month. Not asked, told, because family businesses don't wait for grief, he said, and I was young, I'd land somewhere. There was one thing my in-laws had conveniently forgotten in all their planning: one name on one deed at the county clerk's office that wasn't theirs. What my mother-in-law did to my husband's workshop 3 weeks later still makes my stomach turn. And what I finally said to her through a locked screen door made her sit down right there on my porch step. Welcome back to Calm Drama Vault, where the quiet ones finally tell the whole story, start to finish, in their own steady voice. If stories about grief, boundaries, and the cost of finally saying enough speak to you, drop a comment and hit subscribe. This one starts in a driveway that used to belong to both of us, but before that driveway means anything, you need to meet the woman who built that house, one payment at a time. Let me back up. I've been a dental hygienist in Tulsa, Oklahoma for 9 years. Not glamorous work, long days, sore hands, patients who flinch at everything. I met my husband, Daniel, at 22, and we didn't come from money, either of us. His family ran a small construction supply business, the kind that looks bigger from the outside than it actually is. Mine ran nothing at all. My mother cleaned offices at night. So when Daniel and I bought our first and only house, 6 years ago, it wasn't a gift from anyone. It was 2 incomes, 2 sets of overtime, and a lot of ramen dinners in a rental apartment before that. The down payment came from my savings and half of his. The mortgage went in both our names, but the house itself, the actual title, sat in mine alone. Because of a small, boring, unglamorous reason, my credit score was better, and the lender gave us a lower rate that way. Daniel used to joke about it at family dinners. Renee owns me and the house, he'd say. And his mother would laugh a little too hard, a little too long, like the joke bothered her more than she let on. I noticed that laugh. I filed it away and didn't think much of it, because back then I still believed my in-laws liked me. I was wrong about the timeline of when that stopped, not about the fact. Daniel died in March. A workplace accident at the supply yard. His own family owned a forklift, a stack of lumber, 30 seconds that undid 6 years. I won't dwell on that part of this story, because it isn't the part that needs telling. What needs telling is what happened after. For the first 2 weeks, his mother, Linda, was in my house constantly, cooking, cleaning, answering the door so I didn't have to. I was grateful. Genuinely, grief makes you soft in places you didn't know were hard. And I let her in because I thought that's what family did for each other. But help, in Linda's hands, was never just help. It came with inventory. She'd open my cabinets and comment on what wasn't organized right. She'd stand in Daniel's workshop, his actual workshop, the converted garage where he built furniture on weekends, and run her hand along his tools like she was already deciding what stayed and what went. I told myself grief makes everyone strange. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight for days after burying my husband. Then, on a Thursday morning, Linda's husband Robert showed up, Daniel's father, a man I'd maybe had 10 real conversations with in 6 years of marriage. He didn't knock so much as let himself in, the way he always had when Daniel was alive, and he found me at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork I didn't have the strength to look at yet. He sat down across from me, folded his hands the way men do when they've rehearsed something, and said, "Renee, we need to talk about the house." I said, "Okay," because I genuinely thought he meant helping me with a mortgage payment, or insurance paperwork, or something practical a grieving daughter-in-law might need. He did not mean that. He told me the market was good right now, that a house this size, this location, would move fast, that the business had taken a hit covering funeral costs and his words, unexpected liability exposure from the accident, and that Daniel's half of the equity in this house was, in his mind, still family money. Construction, family money, money that belonged to the business that built it, not to the wife who happened to be standing in the kitchen when the man who earned it died. He slid a business card across my table. A real estate agent, already contacted, already briefed. End of the month works best for us, he said. You're young, Renee, you'll land somewhere. For days, my husband had been in the ground for days, and the man who raised him was measuring my grief against a listing timeline. I looked at that card sitting on my kitchen table, next to a sympathy card that still smelled like the flowers from the funeral home, and I felt something in me go very, very still. I want you to remember that stillness, because it's the same stillness I felt 3 weeks later, standing at my own screen door, watching Linda try to walk into Daniel's workshop with a truck full of movers behind her. But we're not there yet. First, I need to tell you what I actually said to Robert that morning at my kitchen table. Because it was the first time in 6 years I'd ever told either of them no. I looked at Robert's business card sitting on my table, and I did something that surprised even me. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked the card up, turned it over once like I was actually considering it, and set it back down exactly where he'd placed it. "This is my house, Robert," I said. "My name is on the deed. Only mine. You can check with the county if you don't believe me." He didn't flinch the way I expected. He smiled small, patient, the same smile he used when a supplier tried to negotiate a price he'd already decided on. Papers, paper, Renee. But that house was built on this family's work. Daniel's work. Our work. You know that. I know Daniel and I paid for it with our own money, I said. I know I paid the down payment. I know whose name the bank put on the title. And it wasn't because anyone gave me a gift. It was math. He stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket like he was leaving a business meeting that hadn't gone his way, and said the sentence that would replay in my head for the next 6 weeks. "We'll let you grieve a little longer. But this isn't over, Renee. Family looks after family's interests." He let himself out the same way he'd let himself in. No goodbye, just the sound of his truck starting in my driveway. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he left, staring at the sympathy card, at the funeral programs still stacked in a neat pile because I hadn't been able to throw them away yet, and I thought about all the small things I'd swallowed over 6 years of marriage. Linda reorganizing my kitchen to help, Robert calling my job the hygienist thing like it wasn't a real profession, the family Christmas where Daniel's brother got a truck as a graduation gift and I got a card that said "Congratulations on your associate's degree," like it was cute I'd gone to school at all. I'd swallowed all of it because Daniel loved his family, messy as it was, and loving him meant making room for them. Now Daniel was gone. And apparently so was the reason I'd been making room. The pressure campaign started the next morning. And it did not come in the form I expected. It came warm. It came in CASSEROLES. Linda showed up at 9 a.m. with a lasagna and a face full of concern. And she stayed for 3 hours rearranging my pantry and telling me, gently, that grief makes people make decisions they regret. That maybe I should let the family handle the logistics for a while, since I clearly had enough on my plate. She said the word logistics the way you'd say a diagnosis, clinical, final, like there was no version of this where I got a say dot by the end of the week. Daniel's brother, Marcus, texted me a link to a 2-bedroom apartment, listing with the message, "This one's not bad, close to your work too." Nobody had asked me if I wanted an apartment. The listing had simply appeared. The way the moving truck had appeared for my competitor's story. Already booked before the conversation ever happened. I called Marcus. I kept my voice level, the way I do with anxious patients in the chair. "Marcus, I'm not moving out of my house. I don't know what your dad told you, but that's not happening." There was a pause, and in it I could hear a television in the background. The particular silence of someone who has already decided you're the unreasonable one. "Renee, come on. The business took a hit from the accident. Dad's stressed. This house is basically family equity at this point, and honestly, it's a lot of house for just you. For just me. Like I'd shrunk. Like my grief had a square footage limit attached to it. It's a lot of house for just me." I repeated slowly, "that I pay the mortgage on, alone, every single month." He sighed, the exact sigh people give when they've already stopped listening. "You're being emotional about this. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help you simplify." I got off that call and sat very still in my kitchen, understanding something with the kind of clarity that only arrives after you've been underestimated one too many times. My husband's family had never once, in 6 years, asked what I needed. They had only ever told me what I should be grateful for. Aunt figure equivalence in this family came fast after that. Daniel's Aunt Patrice called to ask if I'd really let Robert's blood pressure suffer over a house he practically built. His grandmother, 91 and sharp as a blade, was the only one who called just to ask how I was sleeping, and I nearly cried at the novelty of it. The family narrative machine, as I'd come to think of it, was already running by the following Sunday. I was the widow being difficult, the widow standing between a grieving family and the equity that was rightfully theirs. Nobody in that story mentioned the deed. Nobody mentioned the 6 years of payments. Ownership had simply been edited out. The way you don't mention how the funeral home builds you when you're telling people how brave you're being, so I stopped explaining. I went into Daniel's home office that night, opened the fireproof box in the closet, and read my own name on that deed twice under the desk lamp, the same way I imagined countless women before me have had to read their own names back to themselves just to believe they were real. And then I did what 9 years of watching anxious patients whiten up dental chairs had taught me to do when things start to spiral. I stopped reacting, and I started documenting. There's a particular kind of calm that settles over you once you stop trying to be understood and start trying to survive. I didn't know I had that gear until that week, but once I found it, I never fully lost it again. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Not because I wanted a fight, I still, if I'm honest, hoped this would resolve itself. That Robert would come to his senses. That Linda would stop treating my pantry like enemy territory. But I'd learned enough in 6 days to know that hope wasn't a strategy, and grief doesn't pay a mortgage. I found an attorney named Mr. Whitfield through a coworker, who'd gone through her own ugly divorce. He was patient on the phone in a way I wasn't expecting. The kind of patient that made me realize how braced I'd been for someone else to tell me I was overreacting. "Walk me through it," he said. "Slowly. Don't skip the small stuff. The small stuff is usually where the truth is." So I did. The business card on the funeral table, the apartment listing, the word logistics. He let me talk without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a second before he spoke. "Renee, I want to be very clear with you. Your name, and only your name, is on the title of that home. Your husband's death doesn't change ownership. It doesn't matter who's grieving loudest, or who built the family business, or who thinks equity is a feeling instead of a legal fact. That house is yours. Full stop." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in a week. "But," he continued, "I want you to understand something else, because families like this rarely stop at asking nicely. If they attempt to move belongings in, remove your property, or pressure you into signing anything, and I mean anything, even something that looks harmless, like a quitclaim or a temporary agreement, you call me before you sign a single word. Grieving people sign things they shouldn't. That's not a flaw in you. That's just how grief works, and predatory people know it." I asked him what I should do about the workshop, Daniel's workshop, the converted garage full of half-finished furniture and tools that Linda kept touching like she was inventorying it. "Is any of it titled or registered? Vehicles, trailers, anything with a legal owner listed?" I told him no, just tools. Wood, a table saw Daniel had saved up for over 2 years. "Then it's your property now, as his spouse and next of kin, unless there's a will that says otherwise. If she removes anything without your consent, that's not a family dispute anymore, that's theft. Document everything, photos, dates, texts. If anyone shows up uninvited and tries to take something, you don't confront them physically, you call the police, and you let the paperwork do the fighting." I thanked him and sat in Daniel's office for a long time after we hung up. Looking at the tools on his pegboard, each one hung exactly where he'd left it. I thought about how much of loving someone is really just being the last one standing guard over the things they cared about. I started a notebook that night, not because I thought I'd ever need it in a courtroom, though it turned out I would, but because writing things down is how you keep a story from being rewritten by people who are betting you're too tired to remember it accurately. Every visit, every comment, the exact wording of every text. I dated all of it, the way you'd chart vitals on a patient, not because the numbers are dramatic, but because someone, someday, might need the record. The following Tuesday told me exactly how far ahead of me they already were. Linda called and asked, sweetly, if she could come by to grab a few of Daniel's things to remember him by. I said yes, because refusing felt cruel, and because some sentimental piece of me still wanted to believe this was really about grief. She arrived with her sister and 2 folding moving boxes. I watched from the kitchen window as they went straight to the workshop, not the closet with his clothes, not his nightstand, not the drawer with his watch and his wedding ring that I still hadn't been able to open. The workshop, the table saw, the good chisels he'd inherited from his grandfather, things with resale value, not sentimental value. I walked out before they'd loaded a single box into the trunk. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice level, "what exactly are you taking?" She turned around, unbothered, a chisel already in her hand. "Just a few tools, honey. For Marcus. Daniel would want his brother to have them." "Daniel would want me to have them," I said. "They're in my garage. On my property. And you didn't ask me before you started loading boxes." Her face did something small and sharp. There and gone in under a second, and I understood I'd just seen the real Linda for the first time in 6 years. "You're really going to stand here and fight me over tools while your husband is barely in the ground?" "No," I said. I'm going to stand here and ask you to put them back." She didn't argue further. She set the chisel down, gathered her sister, and left without another word. But that night, I got a text from Marcus that told me everything I needed to know about how this family actually operated. "Mom said you wouldn't even let her take a screwdriver for me. Real classy, Renee. A screwdriver. It's always framed as a screwdriver. Never the $2,000 table saw. Never the good chisels. Never the reality of what was actually in those boxes. Just enough distortion to make me sound small for saying no." I photographed the workshop that night. Every tool, every shelf, time-stamped and dated, and saved the photos in 3 different places. I didn't know yet how badly I'd need them. I only knew, with the same clarity I'd felt looking at that business card, that this wasn't close to over. The practical squeeze began the way it always does, not with anger, but with the sudden, convenient absence of help. For the first 2 weeks, Linda had been in my house daily, and despite everything, some exhausted part of me had leaned on that. She'd bring meals. She'd sit with me so I didn't have to eat dinner alone in a house that still smelled like Daniel's cologne on the pillow. It was manipulative, yes, but it was also, in its own twisted way, real company during a time I badly needed it. After the workshop confrontation, that stopped overnight. No more casserole. No more calls to check in. When I texted Linda about a life insurance form that needed her signature as a secondary contact, she took 4 days to respond, and when she did, it was one line: "Been swamped. We'll talk soon." I understood the arithmetic immediately. Help had never been free. It had been scaffolding, put up around me so the family could reshape the situation while I was too tired to notice. The moment I stopped being reachable, the scaffolding came down. I want to be honest about something, because I think this is the part nobody says out loud in these stories. It almost worked. Grief is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with willpower. I was sleeping for hours a night, forgetting to eat, crying in the grocery store over a brand of coffee Daniel used to buy. There were entire evenings where I thought about calling Robert and telling him fine. Take the house, take the equity, take whatever makes this feel over, because being alone in the loudest silence of my life felt unbearable. What held the line wasn't strength. I want to be exact about that, because I think strength is a word people use to avoid saying the real thing, which is, I had 2 people who showed up with no agenda. My coworker Priya started stopping by after her shifts with groceries and zero commentary about the situation, just company and casual conversation about patients and gossip from the office, the kind of normal I desperately needed. And Daniel's grandmother, the 91-year-old one, the only person in that family who'd called just to ask how I was sleeping, started phoning me every few days. Never once mentioning the house, just asking if I was eating, if I wanted company, if I needed a ride anywhere. Neither of them was obligated to me by blood in the way Linda and Robert were, and yet they were the only 2 people actually carrying any of my weight. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning. I'd left the house early for a dental appointment. I couldn't reschedule funny, being the patient for once instead of the hygienist, and I came home a little after 11 to find Robert's truck in my driveway and the garage door standing wide open. I want you to picture what I saw, because it's the image that changed everything for me. The workshop had been not stolen outright. That would have been simpler, in a strange way, easier to understand. Instead, it had been organized into piles. One pile clearly marked, in Robert's handwriting on masking tape, for the business. Another pile marked for Marcus. A third, smaller pile, shoved into the corner near the trash cans, unmarked. I later realized that pile was meant for me, whatever was left over after the family decided what it wanted. Daniel's good chisels, the ones his grandfather had given him, sat in the business pile. I stood in my own garage, keys still in my hand, and felt the particular cold that comes from realizing someone has walked through your grief like it was inventory day. My hands went numb the way they do at the start of a long shift when I already know it's going to be a hard one. Robert came out from the side yard, wiping his hands on a rag, entirely like he was standing in his own warehouse instead of my garage. "Figured we'd get a head start sorting things out," he said. "Save everyone the awkwardness later." "You went through my garage without asking me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The triage voice, the one that shows up when there's no more room for feelings, only for the next correct action. "It's not really your garage, Renee, is it? It's family property. We built the business that bought half those tools." "No," I said. "You bought some of the raw materials Daniel used for his hobby projects 4 years ago, as a birthday gift. Everything else, he paid for himself." And none of that changes whose name is on the deed to this house, or whose signature is on the receipts I still have for every single tool in this garage. He didn't have an answer for the receipts, because he didn't know they existed. I did, because I'd photographed and documented every single item 2 weeks earlier. The night Linda tried to walk out with a chisel and called it a screwdriver, Robert straightened up, buttoned his jacket the way he had at my kitchen table, and delivered his verdict, cold and final. This isn't over, Renee. You can play house all you want, but this family isn't going to let a stranger walk off with everything Daniel worked for. A stranger. 6 years of marriage. And I'd become a stranger the moment there was equity involved. He left without loading a single box that day, but he left the piles exactly where they were, a silent threat disguised as tidiness. I stood alone in my garage for a long time after his truck pulled away, looking at my husband's tools sorted into piles by people who had never once picked up a hammer in that space while he was alive. That night, I called Mr. Whitfield, and for the first time, my voice shook while I told him what happened. He listened, and when I finished, he said the sentence that finally gave me permission to stop hoping this would resolve itself gently. Renee, this has moved past family disagreement. This is trespassing and attempted removal of property that legally belongs to you. It's time to make this formal. Formal, it turned out, meant paperwork, and paperwork, I was learning, is its own kind of quiet violence. Not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way shouting never is. Mr. Whitfield walked me through it over a phone call I took sitting on my bathroom floor, the only room in the house that still felt neutral, untouched by 6 years of family dinners and now 3 weeks of family invasion. We're going to send a formal notice, he said. It establishes, in writing, that the house and its contents belong solely to you. And it puts them on record that any further entry onto the property without your permission will be treated as trespassing. It also puts your father-in-law on notice that continued attempts to remove property will be treated as theft, and we will pursue it. Will that make it worse? I asked, and I already knew the answer before he gave it. Possibly, short term. People like this rarely respond to boundaries with grace. But right now, you have no boundary in writing, which means you have nothing they're forced to respect. This changes that. I drafted the notice with him that week. My hand shook signing it, the way I imagine it shakes for anyone ending something that's supposed to be permanent, even when the thing you're ending was never healthy to begin with. Family, in theory, isn't supposed to require legal notices, and yet here I was. I mailed it certified, the way he told me to, and I kept the receipt in the same drawer where I kept Daniel's watch and wedding ring, the drawer I still hadn't fully opened. The retaliation, when it came, was not loud. It was, as these things almost always are, warmer and much worse. Patrice called first, gentle and syrupy, to say she'd heard I was escalating things with lawyers. And wasn't that a little extreme for a family that just lost someone? Linda posted a photo on social media of Daniel as a boy, captioned with something about how family sticks together in hard times. Tagged nobody, but everyone who saw it knew exactly who it was aimed at. Marcus texted me a single line. Hope the lawyer's worth losing your whole family over. Nobody, in any of these messages, disputed that the house was mine. Nobody argued the deed. They simply treated ownership as an inconvenient technicality, a rude detail nobody was supposed to mention out loud, the same way you don't discuss the bill at a wake. And the campaign leaned its full weight on the exact same beam every version of this story leans on. Renee's being difficult. Renee's punishing a grieving family. Renee always did think she was better than us. 9 years in dental hygiene teaches you one very specific discipline. When a patient is escalating, panicking, spiraling in the chair, you do not match their energy. You stay level. You narrate calmly. You keep working the procedure regardless of the noise around you. So that's what I did with my own family. I saved every message. I screenshotted every post. I kept my notebook by the coffee maker, dated and specific. Not because I thought a judge would ever care what Patrice thought of my character, but because writing a thing down is how you stop it from rewriting you at 2 in the morning when you're alone with your grief and your doubt. The moving truck moment, the one that told me exactly how far ahead of me they already were, arrived on a Saturday, 10 days after the notice went out. I'd gone to visit Daniel's grandmother that afternoon, the only family visit I still made without dread, and I came home to find a U-Haul parked crookedly in front of my house and Marcus standing in my open garage with 2 of his friends, already loading Daniel's table saw onto a hand truck. I sat in my car in the driveway for 1 full minute before I got out, just breathing, the way you breathe before you walk into a code blue. Then I got out, walked up calmly, and said the only thing that needed saying. Put it down. You're trespassing, and I already called the police on the way in. I hadn't yet, but I did. Right then, standing in my own driveway, phone to my ear. Watching Marcus's face go through several stages of disbelief, before landing on something almost like fear. Because for the first time in this entire ordeal, someone in that family understood that the quiet woman standing in front of them was no longer performing patience for their benefit. The police that day were unremarkable, in the best possible way, to officers who had clearly seen 100 driveways exactly like mine. They checked the address against county records right there on a phone screen, confirmed the deed was in my name alone, and informed Marcus and his friends, politely but firmly, that they needed to unload the truck and leave the property. Marcus went first. And here's the detail that told me everything about who he'd always been underneath the family loyalty. He looked relieved, ordered off the property by a uniform. He no longer had to be the one making the decision. It had been taken out of his hands, which I suspect was the only way Marcus had ever been comfortable with decisions in his life. Someone else making them for him. I thought, standing there watching the truck pull away empty, that this might finally be the end of it. I was wrong. What came next wasn't louder. It was colder, and far more calculated. 2 days later, I got a call from my employer's HR department. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint alleging I'd been erratic and unstable at work, potentially unsafe to be handling patients given recent personal stress. My supervisor, to her credit, told me flatly she didn't believe a word of it. I'd never missed a shift, never had a single complaint in 9 years. But company policy required her to document it and ask. I sat in that HR office and understood, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, exactly what had just been attempted. Someone in my husband's family had aimed an accusation at my livelihood, at my professional reputation, as a pressure tactic in a property dispute they were losing. Nobody confirmed who filed it. I didn't need confirmation. I only needed to understand that there was no line this family wouldn't approach if it meant getting the outcome they wanted. That night, I sat in Daniel's office with my notebook and added the date, the details, the exact wording HR had relayed to me. Not because I expected to ever need it legally. The complaint had been dismissed within the hour. No formal record kept, but because I needed, for myself, an accurate account of what this family was actually capable of. If there had been any road back, any future where I sat at a holiday table with these people and pretended none of this happened, it closed that week. They hadn't just tried to take my house and my husband's tools. They'd tried, even briefly, to take my income, my reputation. The one part of my life that had nothing to do with any of them. You don't negotiate with that. You don't leave that door unlocked twice. Mr. Whitfield and I finalized the last piece of paperwork that Thursday, a formal cease and desist specific to Robert and the business, making clear that any further attempt to enter the property, remove belongings, or contact my employer would result in a restraining order and a police report on record. I signed it at my kitchen table, in the exact spot where Robert had once slid his real estate agent's business card toward me for days after my husband's funeral. Some signatures end a chapter. This one ended a version of myself that still believed being reasonable would eventually be rewarded. I mailed it Friday morning. By Friday evening, my phone had lit up with the family group chat. I was somehow still added to a chat I muted the moment I finished this story. But that week, I still read every word. Linda, she's cutting off her husband's own family. After everything we did for her. Patrice, grief does strange things to people. We should pray for her. Robert said nothing at all in the chat, which somehow felt like the loudest message of them all. He wasn't performing grief or concern. He was regrouping. Sunday, an email arrived from Robert directly. Subject line, final chance to do this the right way. Inside, 2 paragraphs about family legacy and Daniel's memory, and 1 line at the bottom doing all the real work. You have until the end of the month to reconsider, or will be forced to take further action. Further action, as if a man who had already tried to take my house, my husband's tools, and my job in the same 3 weeks had been holding back the entire time. I forwarded the email straight to Mr. Whitfield without responding to Robert at all, and I went to bed that night calmer than I'd been in weeks. Not because the threat didn't scare me. It did, but because for the first time since Daniel died, I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and understanding, it turns out, is its own kind of armor. Let me stop here and ask you something. One person carrying too much to another. If you've ever been the one expected to hand over what you built because someone else decided they needed it more. Tell me in the comments what it cost you. I know I'm not the only one who's lived this. Robert's further action arrived 9 days later. And it wasn't legal at all. It was Linda, standing on my porch on a Tuesday morning, suitcase-sized, moving bag in hand, informing me she'd be staying for a while to help sort things out properly, the way Daniel would have wanted. I hadn't invited her. I hadn't answered a single call from her in over a week. And yet there she stood, bag already packed, treating my porch like a hotel check-in. "Linda, I didn't invite you to stay here," I said through the screen door, which I kept latched, a habit I'd developed without even noticing over the previous month. "Renee, be reasonable. This is still Daniel's home too, whether you want to admit that or not. I raised him in that kind of house. I know what a proper home looks like, and clearly you need help keeping this one together." I looked at her for a long moment through the mesh of the screen door, and something shifted in me the way it does when you finally see a person clearly for the first time, without the softening filter of hoping they'll change. Daniel's name has never been on this deed, Linda. Not once, in 6 years. And you, standing on my porch with a packed bag, doesn't change that. Her face did the same small, sharp thing it had done in the garage weeks earlier. "You've turned into someone I don't recognize." "No," I said quietly. "I've turned into someone who finally stopped explaining herself to people who were never going to listen anyway." She sat down on my porch step then, right there, bag still in her lap, and for one strange moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost, because underneath the manipulation and the entitlement, I think Linda genuinely believed she was owed a version of my grief that made room for hers. She wanted a daughter-in-law who would fold quietly into whatever shape the family needed. The same way, I'd later learn, she herself had folded her entire life into shapes other people decided for her. But sympathy and an open door are two different things. And I had learned, finally, not to confuse them. "I'm not letting you in, Linda," I said, "and if you're still sitting on that step in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police, the same way I did with Marcus. I don't want to, but I will." She left after 8 minutes, wheeling her bag down my front walk with a stiffness that told me this was the first time in a long time someone had told her no and actually meant it. That evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I did something I'd been putting off for weeks. I finally opened the drawer with Daniel's watch and his wedding ring, and I sat with them for a long time, turning the ring over in my palm, thinking about the man who had loved a family that never quite knew how to love him back without conditions attached. I thought about what what Priya, my coworker, had asked me the week before, unpacking groceries in my kitchen like it was her own. "Someday, if you have kids, they're going to hear this whole story. Probably from you. At this exact table. Which version do you want to be telling them?" That question sat with me all week, not whether I could survive being called difficult, being edited out of holiday photos, being the villain at whatever version of this story got passed around at family gatherings I'd no longer be invited to. I could survive that. I'd already survived worse. The real question was which story got told at this table, years from now, and who I'd have become while living inside it. I picked up my phone that night and texted Mr. Whitfield one line. "I'm ready to make the restraining order request formal against Robert and Linda both, and I want the notice about the business's continued involvement filed too." His response came within the hour. "Good, I'll have it ready Monday. You're doing the right thing, Renee." I slept better that night than I had in the 6 weeks since Daniel died. Not because the grief was gone, it never fully leaves. I've come to understand, but because for the first time, I wasn't spending my nights bracing for the next intrusion. I was simply, finally, in my own house, in my own quiet. And it was mine. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks later, and in the space between filing and that date, something unexpected happened. The family, it seemed, made one last coordinated attempt, not through lawyers, not through the police, but through Daniel's grandmother. She called me on a Sunday evening, her voice thinner than I remembered from our earlier calls, and asked if she could come by. Just her. No one else knew, she said. I let her in because in 6 weeks, she was the only person from that family who had never once mentioned the house. She sat at my kitchen table. The same table. Always the same table, where every important and painful conversation in this story seemed to happen, and she told me something I hadn't expected. "When I was 22, she said, my husband's family took the farm my own father left me, signed it over to my brother-in-law because a woman's name on a deed made people uncomfortable back then. Nobody asked me. I found out at a dinner. The same way you found out about that business card. I never got it back. Not 1 acre. I sat very still, listening. I watched Robert grow up hearing that story told like it was normal, like it was just how families protected what mattered. I think, she said slowly, he genuinely believes he's protecting something. Renee, that doesn't make what he's doing to you right, but I wanted you to understand it isn't really about you. It's about a pattern nobody in this family has ever had the courage to stop. I felt something loosen in my chest, the same way it had when Mr. Whitfield first confirmed the deed was solely mine. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something closer to understanding the recognition that cruelty often has its own long, tired inheritance behind it, even when that doesn't excuse a single thing it costs the person standing in its path. They were wrong to do that to you, I told her, and Robert is wrong to try it with me. She nodded, eyes wet, and said the only thing she came to say. I know, I just needed you to hear it from someone in this family. Once, before Thursday, she left an hour later, and it was the last real conversation I had with anyone from Daniel's side before the hearing. Thursday arrived, gray and quiet. I sat in a courtroom that felt smaller than I expected. Mr. Whitfield beside me with a folder of everything, the notice, the certified mail receipts, the HR complaint documentation, the photographs of the workshop time-stamped from 3 separate visits, the group chat screenshots, all of it organized the way I'd learned to organize a chart, clearly, chronologically, without a single unnecessary word. Robert's lawyer argued family equity, emotional distress, the business's financial contribution to shared family assets. The judge listened for exactly as long as courtesy required, then asked a single clarifying question about whose name appeared on the property deed. There was no good answer to that question. Because there was only one name, and it wasn't Robert's, and it wasn't Daniel's, and it wasn't Linda's, it was mine. The order was granted, not permanent, but enough distance, enough legal weight, enough of a wall between my house and the family that had spent 6 weeks trying to walk through it, uninvited, outside the courthouse. In the gray afternoon light, I stood on the steps for a moment before heading to my car, and I felt the same strange mixture, Renee, that I felt that whole spring. Relief, yes, but grief too, thick and unexpected, because somewhere underneath all of it, I had still been hoping, right up until that hearing, that this family might surprise me, that someone besides Daniel's grandmother might finally choose me over the house. Nobody did, and I had to make peace with carrying that loss alongside the loss of my husband. 2 griefs stacked on top of each other, both of them real, both of them mine to hold. Before I tell you how this ends, I want your honest answer, not the polite one. If you were standing in that driveway, business card in hand, for days after burying someone you loved, would you have handed over the keys just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments. Truly, no judgment. Some of you have carried exactly this. 2 months later, the dust had settled into its final shape. Robert's business, I later heard through the one cousin who still quietly kept in touch with me, took a real financial hit that spring, not from the house, but from the accident itself. Insurance claims and equipment downtime that had nothing to do with me at all. I sometimes wonder if the pressure to take my house was never really about equity. I think it was about a man looking for something solid to grab onto while everything else in his business felt like it was slipping, and deciding, without asking, that my house would be the thing that steadied him. That doesn't excuse what he did. It just means I finally understood the shape of it. Linda and I have not spoken since the porch conversation. Marcus sent one text, months later, that simply said, "Sorry about all that, hope you're doing okay." Which was the closest thing to an apology I ever received from anyone in that family, and I decided, after a lot of thought, to let it be enough, not because it healed anything, but because carrying resentment forever felt like handing them one more thing of mine to hold. Daniel's grandmother and I still talk every few weeks. She never brings up the house, never brings up the rest of the family. She asks about my job, my garden, whether I've slept. I've come to understand that some family isn't defined by blood at all, but by who shows up asking the right questions. I kept the workshop exactly as Daniel left it, minus the pieces I eventually did give to Marcus, on my own terms. When he asked properly instead of showing up with a truck, I finished one of Daniel's unfinished projects myself last month, a small bookshelf. Badly cut in places, nothing like the precision he would have managed, but it's standing in my living room now, and every time I look at it, I think about the fact that I built something with my own 2 hands out of something someone tried to take from me. Here's the accounting I owe you, plain and honest, the way this whole story deserves. It cost what it cost. I lost an entire side of family I used to celebrate holidays with. I am In some version of this story still being told at tables I'm no longer invited to. The villain, the cold widow who chose paperwork over people, who let lawyers handle grief that should have been handled with love. Some nights, that still aches, the way an old fracture aches before a storm. You're the strong one, they used to tell me. You'll land on your feet. What they meant, I eventually understood, was, you're the one who won't fight back. And they were half right. I could take it. I just decided, somewhere in that spring, that being able to take something was never a good enough reason to have to. If you carry one thing out of my story, carry this: love that requires you to hand over everything you built will never actually make room for you. It will only ever make room for itself. Build your foundation first, on your own name, in your own house, and then let in only the people who knock softly and wait to be invited. I spent 6 years believing that being easy to take from was the same thing as being loved. The week I stopped believing that was the week I finally understood the house had been mine, fully and completely, the entire time. Don't think about where this story lived. A business card on a funeral table, a chisel called a screwdriver, a driveway full of tools sorted into piles by people who never once picked up a hammer while my husband was alive. If you're the one in your family who's always expected to give the most and ask for the least, hear me from my kitchen table tonight. Your name, on your own life, is not selfishness, it's a deed. If this story reached something real in you, subscribe to Calm Drama Vault, and tell me in the comments what you finally chose to put down. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your locks kind, and your boundaries kinder.